In this lesson, we will be looking at the species concepts. We will learn how to group organisms into different species. In our previous chapter, we have looked at microevolution. These are small changes in the allele frequencies of a population over short times. Generally, we are looking at generation to generation and observing the changes in allele frequencies between these generations. Our next step is to observe macroevolution. On macroevolution, which is the buildup of small changes over longer time frames. These longer time frames can be years or even hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. Keep in mind, the Earth is very old, 4.6 billion years old. Living things have been around for 3.8 billion years. This means that there are very long time scales for us to work with when talking about macroevolution. The process of macroevolution leads to brand new species. Macroevolution produces biodiversity. Biodiversity is the different types of organisms found around the world. We're going to see that biodiversity is vast. Currently, there are about 1.8 million species named and classified. There are more out there. It's estimated that there are somewhere between 10 and 100 million species. The smallest unit of biodiversity is a species. A species is a group of organisms that have a specific set of characteristics. Generally, these organisms are also able to interbreed. There are many ways to define a species. We are going to focus on 3 species concepts that will help us group and organize these organisms. We will talk about the morphological species concept, a DNA-based species concept, and the biological species concept. The first species concept is the morphological species concept. Morphology is the physical traits or the anatomy of an organism. So the morphological species concept uses morphology, these structures, to group organisms. Morphological species concept often compares bones, muscles, skin coverings like hair, feathers, or scales. We can compare teeth, bird beaks and bills, or any other physical trait. Basically, this concept states that if 2 organisms look alike, then they are the same species. This species concept has some problems. There are some organisms of the same species that look very different. A good example of that are dogs. Dogs come in many shapes and sizes, from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. However, these animals are all still the same species. We can also see drastic variations in some types of insects. These butterflies seen at the bottom have 2 color morphs. To the untrained eye, you might think that these are 2 separate species. However, they're the same species. They're able to interbreed. They have many similar structures, but their color patterns are different based on environmental conditions. Another species concept compares the DNA structure of organisms. This is a newer field and still has a lot of questions to be answered. For example, how different does the DNA have to be before we categorize these organisms as 2 separate species? DNA evidence is often used to help support morphological species concept and the next species concept, the biological species concept. The biological species concept focuses on reproduction of organisms. This concept states that if 2 organisms are the same species, they are able to reproduce and have viable, fertile offspring. Viability has to do with the offspring's ability to survive in its environment. Fertility has to do with the offspring's ability to reproduce when it reaches sexual maturity. There are 2 key features of the biological species concept. The first one is these populations have to be able to actually interbreed or possibly interbreed. And the second idea is that we're looking at natural populations, ones found out in nature on their own, not in places like zoos or laboratories. The biological species concept focuses on reproductive barriers. These are isolation mechanisms. Reproductive barriers prevent successful reproduction in organisms. There are two types of reproductive barriers that we can investigate. Prezygotic barriers, ones that occur before the formation of the zygote during fertilization, and postzygotic barriers, which occur after the formation of the zygote. We're going to look at several types of both prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. The first prezygotic barrier we're going to look at is habitat isolation. So, are these organisms found in the same place? An interesting example are jaguars and leopards. These big cats both look fairly similar. They're spotted, they live in jungles, and have a very similar behavior. However, these animals are not found on the same continent, let alone in the same area. This means that natural populations of jaguars and leopards will never meet, and therefore these animals are two separate species because they will never reproduce together. Another example are true wild horses, which are found in one region of Mongolia, and zebras, which are found in Africa. These animals, again, are in different places, which means that they will never meet and their populations will never be able to reproduce. Another type of prezygotic barrier is temporal isolation. This has to do with the timing of reproduction. If we look at these two frogs, the leopard frog and the wood frog, we see that they look fairly similar. However, the wood frog and the leopard frog reproduced at different times during the year. The third type of prezygotic barrier is behavioral isolation. Do the behaviors of these organisms match? One interesting example is courtship displays that we see in birds. Birds are notorious for their dances. And if they do not have the correct dance, then they will not be able to reproduce with the female. One example are the blue-footed boobies found in the Galapagos Islands. These birds start their dance by showing off their bright blue feet. If the female is interested, she will stick around. The male will then start to posture, flipping his wings forward and pointing his head and tail at the sky. If the female likes what she sees, she'll start to dance as well, showing off her feet and then posturing back to the male. Many different seabirds have dances that they use as courtship. If this dance does not match exactly what the female is looking for, she will ignore you and you will not get to reproduce. There are many examples of behavioral isolation. Courtship is just one. We also see gift-giving, fighting, and songs common in the animal kingdom. Mechanical isolation has to do with the reproductive parts. Do the parts match? If not, these animals will not be able to reproduce. Reptiles are notorious for having uniquely shaped reproductive equipment. In this case, if the reptiles don't have the same shaped reproductive equipment, so male penis doesn't match the female vagina, those animals cannot reproduce. Another interesting example are in dragonflies. Dragonflies have claspers on the end of their tails. The males must clasp the female behind the neck to be able to form a loop of love for when they reproduce. If the male clasper does not match the shape of the female's head, he cannot grab hold of her, and they cannot make their little loop, so that reproduction will not occur. This is another example of mechanical isolation where parts must match for reproduction to occur. Another type of prezygotic barrier is gametic isolation. In this one, we have to look at the egg and sperm cells. Can they fuse in order to form the zygote? There are many different types of protein receptors and chemicals found on the cell membranes of both egg cells and sperm cells. If these receptors don't match, the sperm cell will be rejected and it will not be able to fuse with the egg cell, which means that reproduction will not occur. After fertilization occurs, there are three types of postzygotic barriers that can still occur. One is zygote viability. So do the zygotes survive till birth, and can they survive in their environment afterwards? We can also look at hybrid sterility. So can these offspring reproduce themselves? A hybrid is often formed whenever we have two species mixing together. This hybrid offspring may be sterile or unable to make babies. A good example of this are mules. If you mate a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. mules are generally sterile and unable to reproduce. The same is true of zebra-horse hybrids. These animals are viable, they can survive, but they are sterile and unable to reproduce. We can also look at the F2 generation, so grandkids. Can the second generation of hybrids survive, and are they sterile? To be able to truly be one species, these animals or organisms have to continue to reproduce for many, many, many generations, not just one or two. So a good example of this is occasionally you find a mule who can breed, but their children cannot. So the second generation or the grandchildren of the horse and donkey are sterile. An interesting example of this hybrid situation is when lions and tigers are bred together. So we can look at several types of reproductive barriers that can occur between these two groups. The first one has to do with habitats of the lions and tigers. Generally in nature, these animals are not found together, and therefore their populations will not breed or mix together. Okay? In zoos, we do sometimes see ligers being born whenever lions and tigers are housed in the same enclosure. However, these ligers are hybrids that are sterile. The biological species concept has some problems as well. This concept does not work well if organisms reproduce asexually or make clones of themselves. For this species concept to work, we have to have a reproductive event between two individuals, male and female. This species concept also has problems when trying to apply it to fossils. It's very difficult to tell if two fossil skeletons have ever reproduced together. So, when looking at fossils and asexually reproducing organisms, scientists have to rely on other species concepts, generally the morphological species concept, to help them group and classify organisms. In this lesson, we have looked at three types of species concepts. The morphological species concept, where we identify species based on their physical traits. We've looked at the DNA species concept, where we classify organisms based on their DNA similarities. And we've looked at the biological species concept, which focuses on reproduction